At the height of the Syrian civil war, a group of vigilantes from Tel Mardich took control of some ancient ruins just outside their town. The arrows of the right claimed they were protecting the site from fundamentalists who wanted to destroy it. Order broke down as some villagers tried to pillage a crypt, and bones were left scattered on the ground. Some of the guards began to make their own excavations into the walls and floors of the ancient buildings. But this was not the first time this site had been raided. 4,400 years ago, the settlement experienced its first sacking and burning by a rival city-state. Idols were smashed, walls knocked down, and an archive of thousands of clay tablets was burnt. The cuneiform inscriptions hardened in the heat of the flames, preserving records of an ancient city we now call Ebla. Fortunately, these written treasures of Ebla had been excavated and taken to safety long before the civil war began. One story contained in these tablets would totally change our understanding of ancient religion.
Path seldom trod.
In 2500 BC, the city of Ebla controlled trade routes in an area roughly half the size of Syria today. Many of the clay tablets that have survived are records of commercial transactions. However, one inscription tells a strange little story. A royal couple were getting married. As part of the ceremony, they were to enter the mausoleum in the heart of the city, dressed as the embodiment of male and female gods. Before this took place, the people of the city had to purge themselves of impurity. A goat was selected, and a silver bracelet placed around its neck. The animal was then cast out into the wilderness. The strange purification ceremony of Ebla is the earliest written record of the scapegoat ritual in human history. Whatever it was that attracted the people of Ebla to this ritual also attracted neighbouring peoples. Hittite ceremonies sometimes involved a bull or ewe, or enemy captive, who was sent out into the wilderness, carrying away the impurity or sickness of the community. In one case, a mouse was used. In a later Neo-Assyrian ritual, a frog is the object onto which impurity and evil is transferred. The most famous scapegoating ceremony is the one recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Then Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, and confess over it all the sins of the people of Israel. The goat shall bear on itself all their sins to a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. Each year, during the festival of Yom Kippur, 2 goats would be chosen by the high priest. One would be sacrificed to Yahweh, and another would have the sins of the Israelite people placed upon it. The second goat was designated for Azazel. Azazel was not a god like Yahweh. The word symbolized the spirit of impurity and defilement. The sins of the people were returned to the place from which they had come. Later Jewish sources tell of a more elaborate ceremony. The priest would lead the goat out of the city. Sometimes its hair would be pulled by the crowd to drive it away. The goat was led to the top of Jabal Mutar, a high mountain in the wasteland between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. A red cord would be tied around its horns before the priest pushed the goat down the cliff to its death. A piece of the red cord retained by the priest was supposed to turn white to symbolize the purification of the people. Like the ritual in Ebla, this Jewish ritual was not designed to placate a god with a sacrifice. Other ceremonies were reserved for this. The scapegoat purified the community by the transfer of defilement and sin. In a sense, it seems a strange way to think about the world. How can something in us be transferred onto another creature and sent away? But although the idea may now seem strange, it was not just the people of the Levant and Near East who found it compelling. Hipponax was a Greek poet living in the city of Ephesus in about 500 BC. He was most famous for his witty poems and ugly face. In his poetry we have the first record of the pharmakos tradition in ancient Greece. One must cleanse the city by pelting him in the field and beating him with twigs like a scapegoat. He must be chosen from amongst you as a scapegoat, that he may be led out the city as a scapegoat. The expulsion of the scapegoat, or pharmakos, was an annual tradition carried out during the harvest festival of Thargelia. A man or woman would be chosen to be the scapegoat for that year. They would be feasted and honoured for a day, before being driven out of the city by a crowd, throwing stones and beating them with sticks. Flutes would be played to celebrate the occasion. Sometimes they were killed, for example during times of famine and plague, but more often the pharmakos was left bruised and in permanent exile. Often the pharmakos was someone physically deformed or poor. They were characterized as a greedy person who was a threat to the new harvest. In Hipponax's poetry, he sometimes complains that his enemies are trying to make him a pharmakos. In response, he attacks others, arguing they should be the pharmakos instead. One famous pharmakos victim may have been Aesop. Known for his fables, the short, ugly Aesop was killed by the people of Delphi during a period of famine and plague. 200 years after Hipponax, a slightly different tradition of scapegoating had been developed in Athens. In a process called ostracism, the citizens of the city would decide to vote to have another prominent citizen removed. The person would leave Athens for 10 years, but retain their property and the right to return after a decade. During times of crisis or poor political decision-making, ostracism could serve as a controlled way to direct the anger and frustration of the citizens of Athens. The Greek practice of ostracism may be the first record of political scapegoating, but perhaps the greatest scapegoat figure of the ancient Greek world is a mythological one, Oedipus. After saving the city of Thebes by answering the riddles of the Sphinx, Oedipus marries and happily rules the city until a terrible plague strikes. It is only then, as he searches for the source of the disaster, that he discovers he has unknowingly murdered his father and married his mother. In his horror, Oedipus blinds himself before leaving the city for a wandering exile in the wilderness. Oedipus is a scapegoat who believes the accusations made against him. Even though he was innocent in his intentions, he scapegoats himself to save Thebes from the plague. The animal scapegoating of Ebla and Israel seems suddenly more humane when placed in the context of human scapegoating in ancient Greece. It would be a 1st century religious movement which combined the two traditions into a powerful, world-changing idea. A bearded religious teacher is preaching in the wilderness outside the towns of the Roman province of Judea in the 1st century AD. He sees a younger man just starting his career as a religious teacher approach the crowd he is talking with. He points to him suddenly and bellows with astonishing confidence, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Less than a century after the death of Jesus Christ, this story was written down in the Gospel of John. The Gospel writers drew on many different pictures from the Hebrew Bible, including the idea of the sacrifice to placate the anger of Yahweh. But the imagery of the scapegoat is also present. Before Jesus' crucifixion, he is mockingly honoured as a king by the Roman soldiers. This mirrors the honour given to the Pharmakos before his persecution. Jesus is also given a red robe, like the scarlet cord of the Jewish scapegoat. He is beaten and mocked, driven out of the city into the wilderness where, on top of a hill, he is finally killed to purify the people. The letter of Barnabas is not part of the Christian Bible today, but there is evidence that many early Christians considered it a useful and instructive book. In the 7th chapter, the writer draws the parallels between the Jewish scapegoat and the death of Jesus. Pay attention to what he commands. Take 2 fine goats who are alike, and offer them as a sacrifice, and let the priest take one of them as a whole burnt offering for sins. But what will they do with the other? The other, he says, is cursed. Pay attention to how the type of Jesus is revealed. And all of you shall spit on it, and pierce it, and wrap a piece of scarlet wool around its head, and so let it be cast out into the wilderness. But Jesus goes beyond the scapegoat ritual. The transfer of impurity is made, but Jesus overcomes sin and destroys it. In the wilderness he wrestles with Azazel and defeats him. John tells us he is the sinless Lamb of God. In the Western Christian tradition, the scapegoat motif was gradually demoted to a secondary or tertiary view of the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the Middle Ages, Anselm of Canterbury wrote against the idea, arguing it obscured the fact Jesus was a willing sacrifice. During the Protestant Reformation, John Calvin rejected the idea for similar reasons. The scapegoat seemed to be reduced to a small footnote in Western Christian history. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, it somehow found its way back into the popular consciousness. The translation of the Bible into English after the Protestant Reformation created the word scapegoat in English. But it wasn't until the 19th century that people began to suspect that this might be a phenomenon with a story that reached far beyond the Bible. In 1913, James Fraser published the scapegoat section of his work, The Golden Bough, a summary of all the anthropological research done in the previous century. Fraser saw the scapegoat ritual as a key component of pre-modern societies. The notion that we can transfer our guilt and sufferings to some other being is familiar to the savage mind. It arises from a confusion between the physical and the mental. The savage fancies that it is possible to shift the burden of his pains and sorrows to another, who will suffer them in his stead. This idea of people transferring a feeling they have onto someone else had been popularized by the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. In his book on the essence of Christianity, Feuerbach argued that the Christian God was a creation of human feelings and desires. Positive, good, and noble things were projected by people onto God, so that humans found what they desired in him. If good things could be projected, the opposite was also true. This was an idea used by Sigmund Freud in his book Totem and Taboo, where he compared the mental state of patients he called neurotic with people from pre-modern societies he described as savages. Both neurotics and savages, he argued, create surrogate victims onto whom the violent tendencies of the group can be released. It was only after the terrible wars and persecutions of the 20th century that the idea of the scapegoat moved from something that characterized the mentally ill or pre-modern world to a phenomenon that we all could be sucked into. It was the theorist René Girard who developed a new model for the scapegoat. Girard argued that groups of humans had a problem. They all wanted the same thing, an idea he called mimetic desire. Sadly, not everyone can have what they want, which creates tensions within groups. To deal with this tension, the anger and violence of the group is directed at an individual, who is scapegoated. The ritual allows people to let off steam and feel collective togetherness through the sensations of relief after carrying out a violent act. This is a foundational process in human civilization which allows groups of people to live together and cooperate. Strange Neolithic burials of people with physical abnormalities, or victims of repeated stonings, point towards the scapegoat ritual. But the scapegoat was not necessarily someone at the bottom of the social hierarchy. It could be a great ruler, or even a mythical figure in a foundational myth. Accusations of abhorrent behavior characterize the scapegoat, justifying the violence carried out by the community. But because the scapegoat brings social peace through their suffering, they are also often worshipped or granted divine qualities. The power of the scapegoat process means that sometimes even the victim accepts the accusations against them. For example, people who confessed when falsely accused of witchcraft. But there is something very special about the story of Jesus. He is accused and executed, but he refuses the accusations made by his persecutors. Before the Romans and Jewish religious leaders, he never accepts any guilt. When he rises from the dead, he demonstrates his innocence. For Girard, in the Gospel stories we have the first exposure of the scapegoating pattern in human history. Jesus is a victim who has firmly decided to reject the illusions of his persecutors. On the cross, Jesus says of his persecutors, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." They know not what they do. This is why he must forgive them. In this passage we have the first definition of the unconscious in human history. There is nothing unique about Jesus' death in terms of the pain and suffering. It is unique only in what it reveals to us. Jesus, the innocent scapegoat who refused the accusations made against him, exposed forever the unconscious mechanism of scapegoating that has been foundational to human civilization. Scapegoating continues, but now we are shameful persecutors. If you find yourself in the city of Srinagar, in the Vale of Kashmir, you can take a taxi on the long road up the 3,000-meter plateau to the town of Leh, in the foothills of the Himalayas. At the end of the Tibetan lunar year, a strange festival takes place. An effigy is created by the Buddhist monks and paraded through the town, absorbing the evils and impurities that have built up throughout the year. It is then burnt in front of the crowd. Dosmoche is also known as the festival of the scapegoat. If this kind of ritualized, self-conscious scapegoating is alive and well in some parts of the world, in many places it has disappeared. In Syria, the towns around the ruins of Ebla long ago forgot the custom of sending a scapegoat into the wilderness to purify the community. In fact, as the civil war raged, many Syrians themselves chose to leave their homes and flee to Turkey, Egypt, and Lebanon. In Lebanon, a country already suffering from an economic crisis, the Syrian refugees soon found themselves being blamed for problems that could be traced back decades. Politicians and news organizations found a convenient scapegoat in the newcomers. Removing the Syrians, they suggested, would alleviate the problems many ordinary Lebanese people faced. By 2023, forced deportations of Syrian refugees were started by the Lebanese government, and many Syrians found themselves on the long road back to the land of Ebla. There is a cruel irony this should all happen in the region where the first scapegoats were cast out. The behaviour of the ancient people of Ebla may seem strange and illogical to us today, but there was something deeply practical in what they were doing. There was a pattern of behaviour in human society they did not attempt to deny. Rather, it was something they embraced in order to control. If you or someone you know has experienced rejection by a group, I hope this video has provided some helpful perspective. For more content like this, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. I wish you a calm and peaceful day.